The night air over the Richmond Inner Harbor hung heavy with coal smoke and the smell of wet steel. The date was the early spring of 1943, and the clock had not yet struck 4 in the morning when a young German prisoner of war, one of several thousand recently brought from North Africa, heard the low groan of metal rollers somewhere beyond the fences. His hands were cold. The canvas of his jacket could not keep out the damp. Yet his eyes stayed fixed on the shapes beyond the shoreline, the cranes, the floodlights, the silhouettes of a city of factories that never seemed to sleep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He had been told the Americans were wealthy, careless, undisciplined. He had been told that their workers were soft, that their industrial boasts were mere propaganda. But he listened to the rumbling in the darkness with a tightness in his throat he could not quite name. For a moment, he thought he could hear thousands of hammers striking steel, the noise rolling together into a kind of mechanical thunder. It reminded him of stories whispered among German U-boat crews, the ones who claimed that somewhere on the far side of the world, the Americans were producing ships faster than torpedoes could sink them. He had laughed then. Now he was uncertain. Beyond the looming cranes stood a hull several hundred feet in length, seam-welded plates rising like a small grey mountain. He could barely make out the stenciled numbers on the bow in the dim light. A guard told him the ship had not existed a month ago. That was absurd. In Germany, even a merchant ship took more than a year. A proper freighter demanded thousands of hands, countless rivets, precision machining, months upon months of work. The floodlights flickered, illuminating just enough to reveal scaffolding still clinging to the upper decks. The German man watched workers climb those frames, torches blooming white against the windy dark. They were still welding, still cutting steel, still fitting pipes and boilers. The enormous vessel looked unfinished, yet by midday, the guard explained, she would slide into the harbour, flags flying, whistles blowing, as though she had been built over years instead of weeks. She was a liberty ship, one of thousands being borne this way across the nation. The prisoner stared in silence. He felt the disturbing sensation that something immense was happening here, something that none of his commanders in North Africa or Europe had described honestly. He was witnessing not prophecy or rumour, but the steady glow of a reality that would take months for the German High Command to fully grasp. A reality forged not in secret laboratories nor on distant battlefields, but in factories like this. Early mornings, molten steel, men and women at the line, building ordinary ships in extraordinary numbers. Somewhere, deep in his memory, came the voice of a Kriegsmarine officer lecturing about the Battle of the Atlantic. Victory would come, the officer insisted, because Germany could sink merchant ships far faster than the Allies could replace them. It was mathematics, he said. Material capacity, hard logic. For every hull the U-boats sent down, it would take months for the Americans to build another. Germany only needed to sink ships at a rate the enemy could not match. If that happened, Britain would starve. American industry would become irrelevant. But the prisoner now stood in front of a truth that shattered the arithmetic. The Americans were replacing losses not in years, scarcely in months, but in handfuls of weeks. Soon, he would hear rumours of a Liberty ship launched after only a little more than 4 days, barely enough time to assemble the scaffolding. He did not yet believe such rumours, but he would. At first light, the harbour horns called the shifts, to their stations. An official stood beside the vessel's bow, clearing his throat as though preparing for ceremony. A cluster of workers had gathered near the forefoot, still wearing their gloves and protective hoods. The prisoner heard the name of the ship announced another in a long line of identical vessels, all steel hull and straight cargo holds, designed not to inspire or impress, but simply to exist in crushing numbers. And silently, he understood the central question that would haunt German intelligence for the rest of the war. How was such a thing possible? The story begins not with steel, but with fear. In the winter of 1939, the outbreak of war in Europe forced Allied planners to confront a question they could not yet answer. How would Britain survive if the sea lanes fell? The German U-boat fleet, though small, had already shown its teeth. Submarines prowled the North Atlantic shipping routes, hunting tankers, freighters, transports any vessel, carrying the food, fuel, and munitions Britain required. With each torpedo that struck, another column of fire roared up from the sea. Another shipment of grain or fuel vanished under the waves. The British merchant fleet, though substantial, could not withstand such losses indefinitely. Even as early as 1940, careful men in London began calculating how quickly new ships could be built to replace those sinking every week. The mathematics was grim. At the time, a large cargo ship required many months to construct. There were too few shipyards, too few workers. Every day, the Admiralty received new casualty reports. Ships struck near Iceland, near Ireland, sometimes within sight of their home ports. In that bleak winter, a committee within the British government began to consider a desperate option: outsourcing. The United States, still neutral, possessed the world's largest industrial infrastructure. Though her shipyards lay mostly idle, they offered facilities far beyond anything available in Britain. In theory, American workers could build merchant ships, simple, rugged vessels capable of transporting cargo faster than the Germans could sink it. The plan was politically sensitive. It required enormous capital and the reorientation of shipbuilding capacity toward foreign needs. Yet Britain had little choice. Without supplies, the nation would starve. Thus, British representatives approached the American Maritime Commission with specifications for a basic tramp steamer. The design was uninspired straight lines, a triple expansion steam engine of 19th century principle, a top speed scarcely above 11 knots. The ship would not be elegant. She would not outrun submarines, but she would be cheap. Her parts could be standardized. Her construction could be delegated to new yards. She could be built by the thousand. The British called the design the Empire ship. In 1940, the United States reviewed the proposal. The Maritime Commission President, Admiral Emery Land, understood at once that this plan required more than construction. It required reinvention. Traditional American shipyards worked slowly and carefully. Rivets were hammered by teams with specialized skill. Keels sat in dry dock for month upon month. If such methods continued, no more than a few dozen ships a year could be produced. Yet the British were asking for hundreds. The Maritime Commission, therefore, turned to a man who, like Henry Kaiser in the sphere of naval construction, possessed no traditional shipbuilding pedigree. His name was Henry J. Kaiser, a contractor who had built dams and highways, vast projects requiring logistics, organization, and relentless scheduling. He did not think in the increments of rivets or hull plates. He thought in tonnage, in movement, in the organization of thousands of hands under a single purpose. Kaiser accepted. He examined the British design and saw not a ship but a structure, something that could be broken into sections, fabricated in parallel, and assembled almost as one would erect a building. He proposed new shipyards facilities that did not yet exist on the American West Coast. They would be staffed by men and women trained not over years, but over weeks. Production would be continuous, in shifts that never ended. The sun would set and rise, yet the work would not stop. In Washington, many doubted. In Berlin, observers dismissed the idea as absurd. But Kaiser began building. Before the United States entered the war, these shipyards began to take shape. Raw steel rolled in by rail car, and workers, many of them with no prior experience, learned to weld rather than rivet. Welding, though requiring skill, could be learned quickly. It allowed hull plates to be joined faster, reducing weight and saving precious time. The Liberty ships, as Americans soon called them, were deliberately engineered for this method. Their hulls were simple, their curves gentle, allowing large plates to be joined with minimal complexity. As the months passed, the German U-boat captains continued sinking British and Allied ships at a horrifying rate. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of tonnage. The question was not merely how many submarines Germany possessed, nor how skilled her commanders were. The question was whether the Allies could build ships faster than Germany could destroy them. By 1941, the answer was unknown. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Then came the morning of December 7th, 1941. American neutrality ended. The United States entered the global conflict. Overnight, the urgency surrounding Liberty ship production transformed from an Allied hope into an American necessity. Britain no longer stood alone. The factories of Detroit, Kansas City, and Baltimore geared toward war production. Steel mills worked without pause. New shipyards sprang up like industrial cities across the coasts. Richmond in California, Portland in Oregon, Baltimore in Maryland, South Portland in Maine. The Liberty shipyards became hives of activity. Men who had once worked farms or mines found themselves guiding cranes over welded hulls. Women, tens of thousands, took positions fitting plates, loading supplies, recording manifests, driving rivets, and steering forklifts. Newspapers marveled at the presence of women in positions once thought impossible. Yet what mattered was not social novelty. What mattered was output. Each Liberty ship measured more than 400 feet in length, with holds large enough to swallow tanks, trucks, aviation gasoline, rations, and ammunition. Their triple expansion steam engines, though antiquated, could burn nearly any grade of fuel oil. They were not fast, but they were extraordinarily reliable. A Liberty ship could cross the Atlantic, endure winter storms, navigate submarine-infested waters, and return again and again. German intelligence officers, analyzing the early numbers, dismissed them. The first Liberty ships took months to build. Nothing new, nothing dangerous. Then the timeline began to compress. 7 months. Shipbuilding yards learned to construct hull sections simultaneously, transporting prefabricated blocks to dry dock and welding them together like the pieces of a giant puzzle. The workers gained speed. The managers learned how to coordinate hundreds of subcontractors, plants making boilers, engines, pipes, furniture, wiring, trucks and trains delivered their cargoes in an endless flow. Soon, Liberty ships were launching at intervals measured in weeks. German U-boat captains, risking their lives in the North Atlantic, sent radio reports back to headquarters claiming that enemy freighters seemed almost inexhaustible. For every vessel sunk, another 2 appeared. At first, their superiors assumed exaggeration. Then the intelligence summaries arrived from agents in North America. They described shipyards glowing at night like cities. They described trains hauling steel plate around the clock. They described cranes standing in ranks along the water like cathedral spires. In Berlin, disbelief hardened into concern. The prisoner at Richmond, like hundreds of thousands of workers, soldiers, sailors, and civilians across the world, was witnessing the physical manifestation of that concern. When the Liberty ship slid into the harbour that morning, the splash was accompanied by cheers and the shrill wail of sirens. The German man flinched instinctively, thinking for a moment the noise signalled an air raid. But the guards only smiled. The ceremony lasted minutes. Champagne broke across the bow. The ship rolled, settled, and drifted against her lines. Photographers raised their cameras. Within days, workers would strip away the scaffolding, finish outfitting her, install final stores and equipment. She would take on a crew, and then she would leave one more grey silhouette joining the convoy lanes of the North Atlantic. Her arrival at sea meant cargo. Cargo meant allies fed, armed, clothed. It meant trucks on desert roads, fighters on English airfields, fuel in Russian tanks. It meant that every torpedo fired by a U-boat, every submarine lost to depth charge or aircraft, was one more German effort spent against a seemingly bottomless well. By late 1942 and into 1943, the numbers reached Berlin, and the disbelief turned to something darker. Dread. Reports indicated not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands planned. In some yards, the pace reached an astonishing 42 hours. For German planners, raised on the assumption that industry required mastery, precision, and patience, such numbers were not merely impossible, they were insulting. They contradicted training, tradition, and every intellectual foundation underpinning the German belief in industrial warfare. The German industrial doctrine emphasized specialization, technical skill, the meticulous hand of the trained craftsman. The Liberty ship was an affront to this worldview, a vessel that seemed to declare, "What matters is not elegance, but quantity. Not tradition, but adaptability. Not perfection, but sufficiency." Even more astonishing was the diversity of the workforce. America had drafted its men into the armed forces, yet the shipyards did not empty. Women filled their places. Immigrants, black Americans, rural transplants, and former farmers donned gloves and welding masks. The yards did not ask about lineage, education, or pedigree. They asked only whether one could work. As production accelerated, the German High Command sought explanation. Surely, they reasoned, such output could not be true. Their analysts sifted through shipping records, naval reports, economic data, and every scrap of intelligence gathered by agents abroad. But the figures remained stubborn. They were not propaganda. They were fact. At intelligence headquarters in Berlin, a colonel studied the charts, tracing rising lines that represented American shipbuilding. His pencil hovered over the numbers. He had no mathematical model to describe such growth. He had no answer to the submariner who asked how Germany could prevail if every victory at sea was erased by a replacement launched mere weeks later. The colonel wrote a brief assessment. His conclusion was stark. If American production continued at current rates, Germany could not starve Britain. The Battle of the Atlantic would shift, irrevocably, against the U-boats. In Richmond, the German prisoner watched another hull reach completion. He saw the sparks fall from the welding torches, bright against the grey decks. He saw workers move with purpose, some too young to have known work outside wartime, others old enough to remember the lean years before. He wondered how many more ships would come, how many more men and women would be summoned to this endless procession of steel. He never received an answer. The truth was that the shipyards themselves did not know. The only certainty was motion. Motion and numbers. Steel plates, half an inch thick, cut to standard shapes, bulkheads welded in sequence, prefabricated sections lifted by cranes designed just for this task, engines delivered not one by one, but by the dozen. All of it recorded, scheduled, fed into a system designed to erase delay. To German observers, the Liberty ship became a symbol not merely of American industry, but of American adaptation. The United States had taken a simple British design and transformed it into a production miracle. They had turned the unpredictable craft of shipbuilding into something more akin to assembly. They applied lessons from automobile factories, from dam construction, from commercial supply chains. They shortened the path from ore mine to ocean. The earliest Liberty ships had taken more than 200 days to build, but by 1943 this figure had fallen below 60 days in most yards. And then there was the SS Robert E. Peary, whose hull was assembled in a little more than 4 days, an achievement so shocking that newspapers reported it with equal parts awe and skepticism. The Germans dismissed that record as exaggeration, yet it was true. The prisoner in Richmond did not know the name Robert E. Peary, nor did he care. He cared only for the ship in front of him. He watched her move slowly into the harbour, guided by tugboats. He heard a woman, likely a clerk or inspector, remark that another keel had already been laid where the completed hull had stood. The next ship was already under construction before the previous one had tasted salt water. He imagined rows of ships crossing the Atlantic, their holds packed with crates. He imagined U-boats firing torpedoes, sinking freighters, and he imagined still more ships coming, steel against storm, convoy after convoy. He felt dizzy. His officer at the prison camp, a stern lieutenant captured near El Alamein, tried to reassure him. American morale was fragile, he said. Their workers were soft, their output would falter, but the prisoner had seen with his own eyes what German officers could only imagine. He had seen the cranes, the burning steel, the endless rows of hulls. The workers did not look fragile. They looked determined. What he could not know, what no one yet fully understood, was how deeply this shipbuilding program would shape the outcome of the war. The Liberty ship was not a single vessel. It was an idea that logistics win wars, that materiel, more than tactics, could break an enemy, that the sea, though wide, could be filled with steel. In the months that followed, the prisoner was moved inland. He never again saw the harbour, but the sound of steel against steel remained with him. In his memory, the night air always smelled faintly of coal and salt, and somewhere, beyond the fences, a hull slid into the water with a slow, unstoppable grace. The question that would not leave him was the same question whispered across Berlin, London, and Washington. How could ordinary men and women, farmhands, housewives, mechanics, clerks build ships on a scale that defied every prediction? The answer began long before he stood in the shadows of Richmond Yard No. 2. It began in the quiet committees of London, where desperation overcame tradition. It took shape in Washington, where planners turned to unlikely minds. It found life in new shipyards, born from empty fields, and it travelled, finally, to the hands of workers who learned, quickly, that their labour was a weapon as sharp as any torpedo. And still, the ships came. Steel, welding, numbers. The Battle of the Atlantic would be changed not by a single event, but by 1,000 launches. The prisoner would have understood none of this that first morning. All he knew was that his world, built on German certainty and German instruction, had fractured. He had been taught that the Americans could not build fast, that they lacked discipline, that their industrial claims were impossibilities, exaggerations. Yet here, before dawn, a ship had appeared like a conjuring, a grey shape born from smoke and sparks. He shivered, not from cold. The first Liberty ships began to leave American harbours in convoys, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft. Their decks were stacked with crates, vehicles, drums of fuel. Their holds were filled with food for Britain, ammunition for North Africa, material for Russia. They sailed not as individuals, but as a flood. In Berlin, analysts tried to reconcile reports of this flood with the mathematical models they had developed. Their models assumed that shipyards required skilled labourers with years of training. They assumed that hulls would be riveted, that engines would be handmade. They assumed that only a few coastal cities possessed the necessary infrastructure. But the assumptions were wrong. The United States had discovered a new way of building, a way that Germany, bound by its own beliefs, could not match. By 1943, the tide began to shift. Convoys that once suffered dozens of sinkings now arrived mostly intact. U-boats grew scarce. Their losses mounted. The wolves that once hunted freely now found themselves stalked by sonar and aircraft. Depth charges rained upon the Atlantic. And still, the ships came. The prisoner could not see the ocean, nor the convoys, nor the U-boats hunted beneath freezing waves. But he could imagine them. He could imagine the Liberty ships scattering like sparks across the sea. He could imagine a submarine captain staring through his periscope at another grey silhouette. He could imagine that captain firing, sinking one ship, only to learn that 2 more had departed the shipyards the previous week. He could imagine the feeling that no matter how many torpedoes a U-boat carried, the ocean always held more targets. He could imagine the moment when the submarine captain realized that numbers, not bravery or tactics or precision, would decide the war at sea. The prisoner had never believed such things before Richmond. Now he did. He understood, dimly, that the world ran on steel, and that those who produced the most steel would win. And he wondered how a nation of strangers, women and men, speaking dozens of languages, could be united in such labour. He wondered how many more ships would glide into the ocean before the war ended. He would never know, but the Germans learned the truth through bitter experience. 2,710 Liberty ships, No prophecy, no boast, just numbers. And in the realm of war, numbers are destiny. The spring of 1943 brought with it a strange rhythm to the American shipyards. Richmond, Portland, and South Portland buzzed like enormous mechanical hives. Work never paused. The Liberty ships moved from blueprint to launch in record times. Entire sections were fabricated in separate plants, carried by rail or barge to the yard, and welded together as though the hull were a building, not a ship. By late 1943, some ships were taking fewer than 55 days to complete from keel laying to launch. The Germans could not believe it. Their intelligence assumed delays, setbacks, labour disputes, yet reports continued to arrive, ships sliding down the ways one after another, crews boarding newly finished vessels, convoys forming before the previous shipment had even crossed the Atlantic. In Berlin, some officers muttered that America had discovered a secret. Others insisted the reports were exaggerated. Still, the data was undeniable. American production was overwhelming. One shipyard in Richmond had launched a Liberty ship every 42 hours, an industrial tempo the Germans called inconceivable. But these ships were not miracles. They were a product of meticulous planning, standardization, and sheer organizational genius. Kaiser's shipyards had learned to break the production process into discrete steps. Hull plates were cut with precision in one plant. Boilers were manufactured in another. Engines were assembled elsewhere. Subassemblies, deck sections, bulkheads, even masts were built in parallel and then brought to the dry dock for final assembly. The process reduced idle time, minimized wasted labor, and allowed unskilled workers to contribute meaningfully. Women who had never handled a welding torch learned quickly. Former farmers and mechanics became shipbuilders almost overnight. The Germans, watching the Atlantic convoys, began to understand what they had underestimated: the American ability to adapt. U-boat crews encountered what seemed like an endless stream of freighters, yet each loss was replaced in weeks, not months. Convoys departed so regularly that the traditional methods of calculating tonnage losses versus replacement no longer applied. What had been a war of attrition became a war of redundancy, where numbers and speed dominated skill. The psychological impact on German commanders was significant. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, understood the mathematics of sea warfare. He had assumed that the Allies' industrial capacity was limited, that losses at sea could eventually strangle Britain. Yet every intelligence report, every intercepted message, contradicted that assumption. The Atlantic was no longer a battlefield where German strategy could dictate the flow of resources. Instead, it had become a theatre where American industrial production set the pace. Meanwhile, within the shipyards, life was relentless. Workers learned to anticipate each step, to move in unison with the machinery and their colleagues. Any delay could cascade through the production chain. Efficiency was paramount. Labour disputes were rare but carefully managed. The government emphasised patriotism and contribution to the war effort. Posters reminded everyone that each rivet, each weld, each plank of deck contributed to keeping the Allies supplied. Newspapers celebrated record launches, highlighting the names of individual workers who had achieved remarkable feats, not as celebrities but as symbols of collective effort. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, became legendary. Laid down on November 27, 1942, she was launched in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The event was timed, photographed, and broadcast across the country. Engineers and planners marvelled at the achievement, yet insisted it was no fluke. It demonstrated the potential of the Liberty ship program. Every subsequent hull benefited from lessons learned. Cranes were repositioned, subassembly transport refined, welding techniques perfected. What was once exceptional became routine. Across the Atlantic, German analysts struggled to comprehend these developments. Some believed the American speed was deceptive, perhaps achieved through the sacrifice of quality. Yet convoys continued to arrive intact. Supplies reached Britain, North Africa, and the Soviet Union in increasing numbers. Losses at sea, while serious, were compensated by the constant output of Liberty ships. Every torpedo fired by a U-boat could destroy only one ship. American production could replace dozens in the same time. By 1944, the full scope of the Liberty ship program was clear. 2,710 ships would eventually be constructed. Their average build time had fallen to about 50 days, but some yards achieved even faster production. Each vessel carried thousands of tons of cargo trucks, tanks, food, ammunition critical to the Allied war effort. They traversed the Atlantic under constant threat, yet the sheer scale of production began to erode the effectiveness of the U-boat campaign. Germany could not maintain the pace of destruction. Within the yards, the psychological impact on workers was profound. Many had joined the effort reluctantly or out of necessity, yet witnessing the tangible results of their labor created a sense of purpose. Each launch was a small victory, a concrete contribution to a global struggle. When convoys successfully arrived overseas, workers felt as though they had personally participated in turning the tide of the war. The German prisoner in Richmond, now assigned to labor in a shipyard as part of a work detail, observed all of this with a growing sense of unease. He had once believed in the superiority of German industry, the inevitability of mathematical outcomes favoring his nation. Yet every day he saw evidence to the contrary. Hulls rose faster than he could count. Men and women moved in synchronized efficiency. Steel was shaped, welded, and launched in cycles that defied his prior understanding of shipbuilding. He began to understand the lesson that American planners had long embraced. Flexibility, speed, and organization could overcome technical skill and tradition. The success of the Liberty ships also revealed a subtle psychological shift among Allied commanders. Where once the destruction of a convoy caused panic and recalculation, by 1944, naval officers were increasingly confident. Convoys were reinforced with escorts, anti-submarine tactics refined, but the knowledge that replacements were always en route changed strategic calculations. Every loss became tolerable. Every sinking was absorbed into the larger flow of material. Allied confidence grew, not merely in their sailors and soldiers, but in the invisible army of industrial workers and planners behind them. Even the most skeptical observers in Germany could no longer deny reality. Intelligence reports emphasized the scale. Richmond Yard, Portland, and other facilities were producing ships at unprecedented rates. German officers, who had once dismissed American capacity as inferior, were forced to reconcile their training with facts. For every 100 tons of cargo they destroyed, the Allies rebuilt several times that amount. The ocean became a place where quantity could outmatch skill, where numbers had the final word. In essence, the Liberty ship program had transformed the war into a contest of industrial endurance, rather than battlefield heroics alone. The human element cannot be overlooked. Women operating cranes, welders learning on the job, clerks ensuring that manifests were accurate, managers orchestrating thousands of moving parts. These were the faces of a silent army. They did not fire a shot, yet they directly determined the flow of war. The prisoner in Richmond watched, often in awe, as young women guided massive steel plates into place with precision. He began to see that success depended not on individual genius, but on coordination, repetition, and relentless pace. The Liberty ship was a lesson in collective effort. The sum of small, disciplined acts produced an outcome that confounded the most sophisticated intelligence assessments in Berlin. By the end of 1944, Liberty ships were everywhere. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with minimal disruption. Supplies reached front lines in Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. Soviet forces benefited from Lend-Lease shipments. The Battle of the Atlantic shifted decisively. U-boat losses mounted, the effectiveness of submarine warfare declined, and Allied confidence soared. Germany had underestimated not only American production capacity, but the ability of a nation to mobilize millions of ordinary people for extraordinary output. The prisoner, now distant from the harbor, reflected on the scale of what he had seen. 2,710 ships, many constructed in less than 2 months, some in just days. Each ship a testament to ingenuity, organization, and sheer human effort. He realized that war was no longer just a contest of bullets and torpedoes, but a struggle for industrial mastery, where every rivet, every weld, every logistical decision could tip the balance of power. And he understood, finally, why the Germans had been so stunned, why their reports had shifted from disbelief to a quiet, grim recognition. The Liberty ships had achieved something more than transportation. They had transformed perception. They had demonstrated that material output, when combined with innovation and coordination, could dominate even the most formidable enemy. The Atlantic, once a place of terror, became a channel of resilience. The war, in its industrial dimension, was increasingly measured not by engagements or battles, but by the relentless rhythm of production, the unstoppable cadence of steel meeting water, and the inexhaustible capacity of a nation determined to supply its allies. Even as the prisoner was moved farther, inland, he carried the memory of those ships, the glow of welding arcs, the sound of steel against steel, the smell of coal, smoke, and oil. For him, and for many Germans who would later read the reports, the Liberty ship symbolized a profound historical irony. A vessel, simple and standardized, built not for glory but for utility, had become a decisive instrument in a global war. Germany, with all its technological prowess and precise planning, had been outmatched not by a single weapon, but by the sheer speed and adaptability of American industrial power. The lesson endured long after the war ended. Liberty ships, which had seemed mundane and expendable, emerged as icons of American innovation, teamwork, and production. They carried not only cargo but a message, that in modern warfare, the capacity to mobilize, organize, and produce could be as decisive as any battle plan, any weapon, or any general. And for the German observers, the lesson came too late, learned in frustration, disbelief, and eventual acknowledgement of a reality they had long refused to accept. By 1945, the Liberty ship program had fully demonstrated its strategic significance. Thousands of ships had crossed the oceans, linking the United States to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations. Convoys carried everything from tanks and trucks to ammunition, food, and raw materials. The vessels themselves had evolved from crude, utilitarian designs into dependable, seaworthy cargo carriers. Ships that might once have been considered disposable were now symbols of endurance, resilience, and industrial ingenuity. The long-term impact of this effort was profound. The Atlantic and Pacific theatres were no longer governed solely by naval skill or the luck of a convoy's timing. Instead, the balance of the war increasingly depended on the relentless throughput of production lines in the United States. Every Liberty ship launched in record time represented more than steel and rivets. It was proof that a nation's organizational capacity could decisively shape global conflict. German commanders, even as the war drew to a close, had to confront a truth that had been apparent for some time. Technological superiority or tactical expertise could not compensate for the sheer volume and efficiency of Allied logistics. Dönitz himself reflected on this when assessing the collapse of the U-boat campaign. His earlier assumptions that attrition at sea would starve Britain into submission were decisively disproven by the Liberty ship program. The cumulative effect of American industrial output rendered traditional measures of maritime dominance almost meaningless. For Germany, the lesson was clear, though bitter. A war of attrition could be won not by precision alone, but by the relentless scale of production. The people behind the Liberty ships, the engineers, welders, shipyard labourers, and managers, became the unsung heroes of the war. Many had no direct contact with the battlefield, yet their contributions were critical. Kaiser's innovative assembly line techniques, combined with a willingness to train unskilled workers quickly, ensured that the ships rolled off the ways at unprecedented speed. The integration of women into these traditionally male roles further expanded the labour pool and accelerated construction. The Liberty ship program, in effect, democratized production, proving that efficiency and scale could be achieved without sacrificing quality. The ships themselves had their own legacy. Many remained in service after the war, transitioning into commercial freight carriers, supply vessels, and even humanitarian aid ships. Their standardized design made repairs and maintenance simpler, extending their usefulness well into the post-war era. Some were preserved as museum ships, memorials to the men and women whose work had made the Allied victory possible. In every sense, the Liberty ships embodied the industrial philosophy that had underpinned American success during the war: adaptability, standardization, and speed. For the German observers and prisoners who had once watched in disbelief, the lesson remained indelible. What had seemed impossible, a continuous flow of ships, launched faster than one could count, replacing losses almost immediately, was in fact the result of meticulous planning, innovation, and human determination. The prisoner in Richmond, who had first witnessed the construction from the periphery, reflected on the scale and precision of the effort. He understood, finally, that war had become as much about production and logistics as about tactics or strategy. Every rivet, every weld, every coordinated task mattered just as much as the action of a soldier or sailor in combat. The psychological transformation was significant. Where once German planners had viewed the American industrial system with skepticism or disdain, they now recognized its strategic potency. Roosevelt's vision of a nation capable of overwhelming Germany and its allies through production alone was realized in the steel hulls that slid into the water with astonishing regularity. Liberty ships, simple in concept but revolutionary in execution, had reshaped the dynamics of global conflict. They had made attrition irrelevant by redefining the very metrics of war, and so the Liberty ships became more than functional vessels. They became symbols of an industrial philosophy that prioritized speed, coordination, and resilience over elegance or technological sophistication. Their construction demonstrated that a nation's capacity to organize, train, and mobilize a workforce could rival or surpass even the most advanced militaries in the world. Every launch, every convoy, every successful crossing reinforced the idea that victory in modern war was as much a matter of logistics and production as of strategy or courage on the battlefield. In the quiet hours after a launch, when the steel deck glistened under the morning sun and the engines roared to life for their first voyage, the truth of their impact was undeniable. These ships had carried more than cargo. They had carried the very principle that would define the Allied victory, that organized human effort, multiplied across thousands of hands and minds, could overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. By the end of the war, Liberty ships had transported millions of tons of critical supplies, sustained front lines across multiple continents, and reshaped the strategic calculus of the conflict. German disbelief had given way to grudging acknowledgement, but the lesson endured long after 1945. In industrial warfare, numbers, speed, and coordination could decisively shape history, and for those who had built them, welded their seams, and launched them down the ways, the Liberty ships were a testament to human ingenuity, collective effort, and the power of a nation united behind a single, overwhelming purpose. They were simple ships, yet they carried the weight of victory itself, one launch at a time. Among the shipyard floors, the human story often went unnoticed behind the roar of riveting guns and the clang of steel. Men and women worked 12-hour shifts, often 7 days a week, in the blistering heat of summer or the biting cold of winter. Many were inexperienced, drawn from factories, farms, or office jobs, yet they were trained rapidly in welding, riveting, and assembly techniques that had once taken years to master. Supervisors relied on a combination of standardized procedures, hands-on coaching, and an intense sense of urgency. Mistakes could cost time, but not lives, at least not immediately. Still, workers knew that each ship launched represented supplies that would sustain soldiers in Europe and the Pacific, and that knowledge carried weight. One particularly striking example was the launch of the SS Robert E. Peary, completed in just 4 days and 15 hours. The shipyard teams, rotating shifts around the clock, treated the project as both an experiment and a challenge to industrial limits. Newspapers later celebrated the achievement, but inside the yards, there was a profound sense of shared purpose. Welders spoke of the almost meditative focus required to ensure seams held under the stress of heavy cargo, while crane operators marveled at the orchestration of prefabricated sections sliding into place like clockwork. Every task was precise, yet flexible enough to accommodate human error. The Germans, observing from afar, could not fathom how such speed was achievable. Traditional shipbuilding relied on skilled artisans and slow, deliberate construction. The Liberty ship program shattered that model. Prefabricated sections, standardization of components, and simultaneous subassembly meant that a single ship could be launched while others were still in early stages of construction. It was industrial choreography on a massive scale, a human-machine symbiosis that had no precedent. By 1944, the psychological impact on Allied forces was evident. The mere knowledge that replacement ships were continuously available bolstered morale and reduced the perceived threat of U-boat attacks. Convoys sailed with greater confidence, and commanders adjusted strategy, knowing that losses could be mitigated through sheer production capacity. In essence, Liberty ships transformed the Atlantic into a controlled artery rather than a contested battlefield. These ships were more than cargo carriers. They were symbols of coordination, innovation, and human endurance. Each launch, every weld, every rivet spoke to the idea that ordinary people, organized with extraordinary efficiency, could accomplish feats that once seemed impossible, and in doing so, they helped redefine the limits of industrial warfare and the very nature of victory. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.